I certainly don't feel guilty about being a Republican. I've always been a Republican. My father is, his father was. The whole family is a Republican family.
I was a Goldwater girl. I mean, really, we used to wear, you know, little banners which said Goldwater girl. As I was vocally a Republican and for Senator Goldwater.
But when we come to Senator Goldwater, now it seems to me we're up against a very different kind of a man. This man scares me.
If you need a little information on my convictions at this point, I must honestly admit to you that I am not going to vote for Mr. Goldwater. And I don't think any Negro and white person of goodwill will vote for Mr. Goldwater.
Now, maybe I'm wrong. A friend of mine has said to me, listen, just because a man sounds a little irresponsible during a campaign doesn't mean he's going to act irresponsibly. You know that theory that the White House makes the man. I don't buy that.
Goldwater is a man who's not capable of hiding his racist tendencies, and at the same time, he's not capable of even pretending to Negroes that he's their friend.
I wish I was as sure that Goldwater is against war as I am that he's against some of these other things. I wish I could believe that he has the imagination to be able to just shut his eyes and picture what this country would look like after a nuclear war.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Those television shows that he did with the girl plucking the daisy and then the bomb blows up, that started all of this dirty 10-second advertising that you're seeing on television. And it's not only permeating the presidential scene, but I look at television shows in other states. It's down to the Senate, House level.
Liberty Augury, The Life and Death of Barry Goldwater. In the 1960s, politics was set on fire by a revival of old smear tactics that effectively galvanized voters, delivered with the lightning speed that television provided. This use of advertisement would forever change the legacy of political campaigns and came to be the foundational legacy of one particular individual in the Republican Party, Barry Goldwater. Born 1909 in the Arizona Territory, Goldwater enjoyed spending his time taking photographs and operating amateur radio. Later in life, he would be world-renowned for his photography, noting that at one time he had more than 15,000 negatives and some 25 miles of film. Goldwater's extensive understanding of technology allowed him to improve and assist in the daily communication during the Vietnam War, noting that his ham radio call numbers of K7UGA had become one of the best known in the world. His close proximity to the Hopi Reservation near Phoenix sparked his curiosity of the local people, inspiring him to collect more than 400 Kachina dolls, which are now on display at Phoenix's Heard Museum. The collection of Kachina dolls is comprehensive, containing artifacts dating back to as early as the late 19th century. In 1941, Goldwater joined the United States Army, later leaving only to commit himself to the United States Air Force. His legacy in the United States Air Force was deeply impactful, as he would both found and desegregate the Arizona Air National Guard 2 years prior to the official desegregation of the United States military. Goldwater would later remark that over a 60-year period, he flew over 7 million miles, logging over 15,000 hours in the cockpit.
General Goldwater, did you fly her in all the way, sir?
Oh, yeah.
Goldwater would use his flying expertise to not only further his political ambitions, but also to help Arizona natives who were in need of assistance. Referring to some of the nastier Arizona winters of the 20th century, Goldwater stated that he would, quote, collect food and hay and drop them to Indian families and cattle cut off by snowdrift. During his time in the United States Senate, he would champion the rights of Arizona Native Americans, even receiving the name Chischili, meaning curly-haired one, from the Navajo people. Goldwater cherished the tribe so much that he would receive a tattoo on his left hand that identified him with the Native American Smoky Dancers. This tattoo was so important to Goldwater that it would be embossed on his statue in the United States Capitol Museum. Goldwater would first be thrust into the political spotlight when he was elected to Phoenix City Council in 1949, after seeing the widespread corruption, prostitution, and gambling that had moved into the city. This was perfect timing for Goldwater, as he had ambitions that expanded past the Goldwater's family department store window. Building off his previous success in the Phoenix City Council, in 1952, Goldwater used his forward momentum in a run against Democratic Senate Majority Leader Ernest McFarland. Although a challenge, the turbulent nature of Arizona politics at the time left a vacuum that only Goldwater's firebrand tactics could fill. In the time leading up to his run for Senate, the city manager would change 31 times in the 35 years before 1950, with the police chief being fired or resigning 11 times from 1940 to 1950. Goldwater would add that the town of Phoenix had become so petulant with gambling and prostitution that the military declared Phoenix off limits to personnel. Prior to re-election in 1955, Goldwater received notoriety for his collaborative work with President Kennedy on union welfare abuse. On the Labor and Commerce Committees, Goldwater interviewed union bosses such as Dave Beck and Jimmy Hoffa in regard to kickbacks, with the Kennedy brothers attempting to link Hoffa to beatings, intimidation, and even killings. Goldwater maintained that he held no issue with the actual trade union movement or its membership, but instead had problems with the political slush funds of the bosses. Soon after, Goldwater would march into Detroit in order to take on the United Auto Workers Union, where he would become organized labor's #1 opposition. On a following labor reform bill in 1959, the Senate would pass the bill 95-1, with Goldwater being the only man or woman to stand in opposition. Goldwater would reason that the bill did little to reverse the control of unions by organized crime. It was too weak and ineffective to deal with union corruption. And finally, it provided no real protection against secondary boycotts. In the release of Conscience of Conservative, Goldwater became the de facto leader of the Republican Party, with his book becoming the #1 bestseller in college campuses around the nation, selling more than 3.5 million copies to date. In the book, Goldwater often wades knee-deep into constitutionalism, leaving the ultimate change up to the individual and their communities respectively. Goldwater recognized that the United States Constitution was worded in a manner that provided checks and balances to a federal government that would self-perpetuate its own growth, with all power and ability derived from the states. He reasoned that states exclude the Leviathan of federal preemption that seeks to administer a cure for inequality, pointing to the 10th Amendment as evidence. He argued that rights not delegated to the federal government must be delegated to the states, as our founders indicated. It was this system that Goldwater saw as providing a protection against a hungry and tyrannical federal government, as well as a safeguard that protects the underrepresented from demagogues who may persuade the nation to veer from its form of republicanism. Goldwater walked a fine line in delicate times and has a mixed record on civil rights for a contemporary review. During the early civil rights movement, Goldwater would oppose the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, which would be signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. Although Goldwater insisted the opposition lay in the constitutional elements of the bill, Johnson used this as a big win, even though Johnson had opposed the bill in previous votes.
Announced by President Johnson, before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So, tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
There's warm applause from members of both parties as the president sets to work. It is work. He uses nearly 100 pens to affix his signature and date. Souvenirs go to Republican leader Everett Dirksen and Democratic whip Hubert Humphrey. The president seems to have mastered the art.
Senator Goldwater, we have another question here from some of our listeners. You voted against the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Would you do so today, and what is your position now on the proposed Voting Rights Act?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, if the same two items remain in the bill that caused me to think it unconstitutional at that time remained in any bill today, I would have to vote against it. This isn't something, by the way, that you make a determination on from the standpoint of politics. I have no question that had I voted for that bill, I might have softened some of the Negro opposition to my candidacy, but I'm not foolish enough to think that I would have won over the NAACP. I have to live with myself, and I took an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution. And this was the only civil rights bill in 12 years that I couldn't vote for. But it did contain two items that I thought were unconstitutional. One, the court has now said is constitutional, so I have to abide by the court.
Goldwater would take an even more aggressive stance against the Department of Education in his later years, stating the department was obsessed with race, sex, and numbers, not education. If Goldwater had been elected, he stated that he would put the abolition of the Department of Education at the top of his list, only third to the repeal of the War Powers Resolution and a balanced budget.
You know, that's the great trouble with big inflationary government. It takes more and more of your earnings. It slowly but surely destroys individual initiative and responsibility. Government must draw its strength from the people, and as it drains away this strength, it must inevitably undermine the foundations of self-government. I ask you to join me in helping restore the individual freedoms and initiatives this nation once knew, to make government more the servant and not the master of us all. In this free nation, we do not choose to be ruled. We elect to be governed.
In your heart, you know he's right. Vote for Barry Goldwater.
Regarding taxes, Goldwater took a very similar stance to that of civil rights, stating that the aim of egalitarian society is to force equality upon unequal men. Goldwater took the view that you can earn achievement through the hard work and commitment, and such he believed that such individuals in a society will naturally produce a more fruitful bounty than others, and should not be punished for it, as this he would be equivalence of incentivizing individual to be less productive. This is not to say that he believed that the federal government had no stake in the individual's earnings at all, but believed that instead that property and freedom is such as the government should operate solely within their provided powers. In order to ensure an economically strong nation, Goldwater insisted that taxes be curtailed through spending cuts to social welfare. In that the excess programs placed a burden on the economy and of a society, it was a slippery slope to increase federal control. Even with the proposed cuts, Goldwater still remained popular among the younger crowd in the 1960s due to the resurgence of constitutionalism, limited government, and the problem of the looming communist threat. Goldwater strongly opposed collectivism, as he interpreted the situation as being in essence a slave to another individual's will and competence. This is important, as a successful collective must rely on the gentle hand of good-intentioned and trustworthy government, while history shows us a pattern of contrary. Goldwater believed strongly that just as important as the threats abroad was more significant look inwards at our own nation. He believed that, like Russia, we could be toppled easy from the inside, especially when our national philosophy is complacent in being comfortable, equal, and decadent. Goldwater saw the welfare state as being corrosive to the United States economy, as well as being a misplaced objective aimed at the expediency of poverty removal and not the elevation of the individual. And with Goldwater forging a new path for the modern-day libertarian around the world, this is not to say that his entire body of work is viewed by them favorably in the contemporary era. One such reason would be that his stance on foreign policy was proactive and at times tended to be a bit extreme. In the conscience of a conservative, Goldwater both speaks loudly and carries a big stick. Goldwater refers to the common philosophy of politicians of his time, stating that they believe, no matter how important their freedom may be, it is more important to live. This was the opposing stance to Goldwater, as he stated that they would rather honor the chief despot of the Soviets rather than face destruction, He reasoned that if peace is more important than engaging in a shooting war, then the inevitable result is surrender. This early Reagan-esque peace through strength policy took a stance that although it is preferential to live, we must be willing to die for what we believe in. Entering into the 1964 election, Goldwater had some doubts about a political run for president due to the recent assassination of his friend and President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. Having brought the Republican Party philosophy into a semi-consolidated format, Goldwater was the clear conservative candidate and would be drafted by his colleagues in the Senate to represent him in the 1964 election. During his run, Goldwater received loads of support from young constituency across America, including the future presidential candidate Hillary Clinton.
In 1964, during the presidential election of that year, I had the absolutely best teachers for what we used to then call, I think, civics and democracy or government and democracy. Each was a semester course. And they decided they were going to have a mock election. And that we were really going to go all out. We were going to have debates. We were going to have the whole panoply of activities around a mock election. At that time, as Ken Reese has told every reporter in America who has called to ask him, and I understand he runs a one-man information bureau about me, I was a Goldwater girl. I mean, really, we used to wear, little banners which said...
In the same breath, Goldwater's stance on the 1964 Civil Rights Act drew strong rebukes from notable figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Roy Wilkins. In different tones, they condemned Goldwater, with King stating that,
I can give you a little information on my convictions at this point. I must honestly admit to you that I am not going to vote for Mr. Goldwater. We must decide next Tuesday whether America will take the high road of justice and peace, compassion for the poor and underprivileged, or whether this nation will tread the low road of man's inhumanity to man, of injustice, of short-sightedness. I don't think any Negro and white person of goodwill will vote for Mr. Goldwater.
Malcolm X identified Goldwater as a man being...
Well, if Goldwater ever becomes president, one thing his presence in the White House will do, it will make black people in America have to face up to facts, probably for the first time in many, many years. And this in itself is good, in that Goldwater is a man who's not capable of hiding his racist tendencies, and at the same time, he's not capable of even pretending to Negroes that he's their friend. So this will have a tendency to make the Negro, probably for the first time, do something to stand on his own feet and solve his own problem, instead of putting himself in a position to be misled, misused, exploited by the whites who pose as liberals only for the purpose of getting the support of the Negro. So in one sense, Goldwater's coming in will awaken the Negro, and will probably awaken the entire world, more so than the world has been awakened since Hitler.
Goldwater's philosophical legacy is one that would lead to a revival in the modern Republican Party, as well as setting the founding principles for the growing Libertarian Party. The mind of one man redirected the conservative and identitarian politics, shifting the focus back onto the individual and the responsibility to self and nation. Fitting a capstone onto a rather turbulent career as a United States Senator and presidential candidate, in 1988 Goldwater co-authored the release of a final book encapsulating his life with a simple title, Goldwater. Early in the book, Goldwater dived directly in, stating, "My aim has always been to reduce the size of government, not to pass laws, but to repeal them. Whenever possible and practical, government should be at the local and state level, not at Washington." In the book, Goldwater spends quite a bit of time exploring the practices of the federal government and cuts relentlessly into their spending habits. At one point, Goldwater highlighted the insanity of Congress's usage of the mailing system, stating that in a single year, Congress sent out 1 billion pieces of mail at the expense of 96 million, or 4 pieces for every man, woman, or child in the nation. Goldwater also held other significant problems with the money flowing through American politics, as he would note that the expenditures for presidential campaigns had increased by 50% from 1980 to 1984.
This was a huge change from the senatorial candidacy that Goldwater won, only spending a mere $45,000 against Ernest McFarland. In the campaign following Goldwater's retirement from the Senate, Senator John McCain would bank on a significantly larger $3 million war chest to hold the seat for the Republicans. Adding to the plethora of problems that Goldwater saw represented within the American politics was the mischaracterization that had been taking place in the media. Whether looking at the unfair portrayals of Goldwater during '64, or the spliced CBS interview with Phil Jones during the Reagan years, Goldwater saw the media as attempting to unfairly portray politicians. Goldwater identified the problem as going as far back as the invention of the television, stating that news stories involving the federal government in Washington cannot be responsibly summarized in 1 minute. This characterization is one that significantly impacted his legacy, as the clips could live on far longer than the man himself. Whether one is analyzing the Daisy commercial or the Seaboard commercial, one must interpret this solely as political fantasy. It is only within the text that we can find the true Barry Goldwater, the true conscience of a conservative.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.